As the saying goes, if you wait long enough, the old thing becomes new again. In today's episode, how nationalizations are getting another look.
One of the major reasons for it is that there is now a lot more geopolitical risk in the world. There are a lot more crises, moments of extreme urgency when the market can seize up and the prices can skyrocket and there are outright shortages as we're experiencing now. And that sense of geoeconomic risk is why governments, I think, are now choosing to make sure that they have essential resources under their control. My name is Nicholas Mulder. I'm professor of history at Cornell University, where I mainly focus on political and economic history with a specific focus on the history of geoeconomics, so the use of all sorts of coercive measures by states to reach their political objectives.
Economists have long criticized governments' nationalizations, arguing they lead to lower efficiency and less innovation. But as Mulder writes in the latest Finance and Development magazine, state ownership is back.
So at the moment, we're in the middle of a new wave of nationalization. And I think that in the last 5 or so years, you can see that there's a strong trend emerging towards governments reasserting control and in some cases even direct ownership.
Nicholas Mulder sat down with journalist Rhoda Metcalfe to delve deeper into the potential and the risk of rising government ownership.
This trend we're seeing of governments choosing to nationalize certain industries and sectors, is that an indication that state intervention in the economy has become more acceptable?
I think so. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that in the last decade now, we have seen more countries resorting to industrial policy, but also, of course, tariffs, the use of all sorts of trade instruments. And that's a really big shift from what we've had for many decades. And so as that state intervention in trade, in regulation, in other areas has increased, it also has increased in the realm of ownership.
Right. Can you give me some examples?
Sure. So I would say that there's really 2 or 3 major areas. One, which is energy. And that's not just primary energy extraction, so things like oil and gas, but particularly also energy networks, so electricity networks, utilities, and that you can see particularly in Europe. Germany in 2022 nationalized its main utilities provider, Uniper. France took over its electricity provider, Électricité de France. It already had a majority stake in it, but it went to 100% state ownership. Right. So it bought out the remaining private stake. And currently, Belgium is actually looking to nationalize all of its nuclear power plants. Those are 3 examples just in Western European countries in recent years. But then you also have interesting new kinds of energy, new kinds of raw materials and commodities that are important for the renewable energy transition. And there, Latin America has played an important role. So both Chile and Mexico have recently nationalized a lot of their lithium supply or taken their lithium under some kind of state control scheme. And that's very much looking ahead to the need for lithium in use for batteries in the renewable energy transition. Yeah.
Right. Is some of this an indication of a rise in skepticism about private management of public resources?
Well, to some degree, I think. It's also partially the result, I think, of the really big long-run challenge that we've known about for a long time, which is, of course, the climate crisis and the need to really accelerate the transition to renewable energy. There's huge public pressure behind that. And I think that in many countries for a long time, we tried things like emissions trading schemes, and people have grown more impatient with that because they haven't seen a renewable energy uptake at the speed at which they wanted it. And as the current crisis now shows in the world, a lot of countries are still very dependent on importing fossil fuels. So there's also now a really serious security reason, a geopolitical reason to want to not be dependent on those imports. Yeah.
Absolutely. That said, state-run enterprises have been heavily criticized in the past for good reasons, right? Can you talk about why they haven't worked well in many cases?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really an empirical question. In some areas, they haven't done a good job at all. In others, there are industries that are much more conducive to state ownership because there
Right.
are more natural monopolies. And you really cannot make, I think, big blanket statements. And part of the reason that we have these waves of nationalization and privatization is that one or the other perspective dominates. I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Some industries are inherently more conducive, particularly when electricity distribution, transport systems, water management, right? These sorts of very big distributed resources that have a very important public good function. But there are, of course, many governments that have not really done a good job at managing them. Corruption, right? The misappropriation of resources. It can easily become a form of rent seeking.
Right.
At the same time, right, some industries, if you turn those over to private ownership, then it's simply the private sector that has access to those rents. And so there's insufficient competition. I think if you can have an industry where there's really good competition, then private ownership has really serious advantages. But in areas where the monopoly is more natural, there, I think what you need is democratic oversight. So what is the problem is not necessarily state ownership as such. It's the fact that there isn't really a good oversight and institutional integrity and institutional stability. So Norway and the oil industry, for example, right, is a very good example.
Right.
Oil industry has been a classic case of misappropriation of resources in many countries when it's state-owned. So I absolutely don't think that there's a natural argument that oil, hydrocarbons should be state-owned. But in Norway, they've done an incredibly good job of combining it with democratic control and using those resources for public benefit, right? And to increase the long-run resilience of their economy, to make sure that they have a good set of human development outcomes. So that would be one example. But there, I think the question is less state or private ownership and more what are the institutions that are there to kind of keep everything running on the right track.
Certainly, there are some enterprises that benefit the public that are never going to be profitable, right? I mean,
No,
I think about a
exactly.
place like Canada, where I come from.
Mhm.
Up north, internet services, cell phone coverage, that's never going to be profitable because it's not enough. The demand is not big enough and the distances are too wide. And so the only way you're going to get that is if the state is involved.
Exactly. And that's right. I think at a minimal level, it seems that the historic long run norm is that most advanced economies and most societies where people reach a certain level of development do prize a few essential public goods, and they have to do with exactly that, right? Telecommunications, electricity, water, transport infrastructure. And sometimes they will not be profitable. The state remains one of the only actors that can do that.
Right.
And I also think that there's one important thing that we should bring up here, which is that nationalization, right, sometimes is a kind of false god, particularly because, of course, it's also costly to nationalize, right? You have to compensate owners, you have to buy them out. And many developing economies in the 70s nationalized resources when they saw energy prices going up. And then in the 80s, they collapsed, interest rates went up, and they borrowed a lot of money in order to buy out those investors. And then they were left with a really crippling debt load.
And that was the beginning of the debt crisis, essentially, for those developing countries.
Exactly. So you see that the countries that made really major nationalizations, Congo, Jamaica, but also Chile, in the 70s, 60s, and 70s, they then in the 80s were really hit with a very severe debt crisis. So in retrospect, we can say that those countries probably would have been much better off trying to increase, right, say, the royalty payments that they received for the resources or regulate things better. They would have accrued much bigger public benefits, but not the burdens of public ownership. So I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind. In the UK, for example, now in Britain, there's a big debate over the new move to renationalize rail. So slowly the government is letting all the private contracts expire and the government will take over a lot of these railroads. And, that's now basically the second time in British history that the British government will own the railroads. And there's a lot of questions to be answered over, can the government do a better job? Is it better off trying to focus maybe on a few areas of service provision? And there's also a case in the UK of steel. There's only one steel factory left in the UK. And that's on the verge of being nationalized as well, because it otherwise might have to close shop. So there you can see, right, one of the other improvisations that governments might have to undertake is to simply nationalize to make sure that industries stay in their country at all.
The idea that you want to have certain key industries in your country that you can depend on if everything else, goes down the river.
Exactly. And I mean, it does make a lot of sense. If you are going to own the railroads and operate the railroads, you are going to need steel to build trains and track. And so if you cannot produce steel because the division of labor has shifted all of your steel production to other countries, you might not be able to maintain your essential public infrastructure. So this is one of these reasons, right, where nationalization oftentimes it doesn't take over the entire economy, but it does spread oftentimes through adjacent industries.
But you have to play that off against how much it's going to cost you to run the thing.
Exactly. And so I think one of the other things we're seeing at the moment, reason why nationalization is coming back, is because a lot depends on how costly it is. Exactly what you just mentioned. And you see a lot more price shifts now. Volatility is back in the markets, energy, commodities, but also financial, right? Stock market prices of companies are kind of gyrating quite wildly. And that then offers opportunities sometimes for governments, I think, to step in at critical moments and say, okay, here we might want to engage in a takeover because that makes everything predictable, right? And everyone knows exactly what the long run kind of trajectory is of the economy, or they can plan more easily. Now it seems we're kind of tumbling from one crisis into another. So I think that just presents so many opportunities and also public pressure, demands for some kind of intervention, the government doing something to deal with these issues.
And maybe this is a really obvious question, but who really owns the natural resources of a country? Is it the responsibility of a government to manage the natural resources of a country? Is it the patrimony of the population, the natural resources of a country?
It differs by country. So what's interesting is that there's an old lineage of mining law. So Anglo-American mining law says that your subsoil resources as a private owner go all the way down to the center of the earth. Okay. But the continental sort of French-Spanish, which is also the Latin American one, is it's only terrestrial. So that's why governments there own the oil deposits, for example, or the mining deposits. They still say, if you have lithium, you're a private landowner, but there's lithium in the soil, we have the lithium. And so it belongs to the people, not to you as a private owner. Yeah.
That is interesting. So, I mean, it also depends on, whether their country is very highly developed and whether or not, again, I refer to Canada, there's great swaths of Canadian forests that have never been ceded to private ownership. And so that is completely still in the hands of the crown, right? But other places in which the entire country has in some way been affected by private ownership.
Exactly. Yeah. And even the United States, interestingly, right, although we all think of it as an incredibly private ownership-based economy, which it is, still owns a lot of land. So the federal land holdings, particularly in the western part of the United States, some states it owns the majority of land. And then in Asia, what's very interesting is that governments there oftentimes own the land in perpetuity, but what private owners have are land use rights.
I see.
So you buy a lease, basically, and Hong Kong, Singapore, most Chinese, in all of China as well, depending on whether you want it for residential, commercial, or agricultural use, your lease is either 40, 50, or 70 years. So the shortest ones are 20, and it goes all the way up to 70 years. But now there's a big question, right? That process of reform and opening up in China began in 1979. So the first 50-year leases are coming due now. And then the 70-year leases are coming due. And then the question is sort of, okay, what's going to happen to them? Do people need to pay again to have the right for the next 70 years? And they sort of didn't think about it really when they started it.
So nationalization plays out very differently in different countries based on these different traditions.
Exactly. And even it has nothing really to do with, the political system, because Singapore and Hong Kong, which were already always free market economies, basically, also have this. So they just don't have full private ownership in land. And the government funds itself through selling these use rights, basically, because they wanted to keep taxes low. So then they have to keep ownership of all the land.
Right.
Yeah.
So do you have any sense as to where the current wave of nationalizations is taking us in this global economy?
So I think to start with the good news first, we're going to remain a very globalized world, probably even more so in the future than before, but it will take a slightly different pattern. I think there will be less international ownership of certain industries, and I'm thinking here particularly of major public infrastructure. I think there's a big wave, not only explicitly of nationalization, but simply of national security protection, of regulation, of screening of foreign investment, right? Who owns this foreign infrastructure? Right. So that's a sector where I would expect there to be less international ownership. Some other sectors, however, I think are still completely fair game and very investable. across borders. I would say this is a shift in ownership. And of course, and I think that that's already very much the world we live in, investors are going to have to take into account what government's national security concerns are and try to kind of diversify, right? Not to be too dependent on one market,
Right.
not to be too exposed to it when a government suddenly changes the regulation. And that, I think, the only viable long-run strategy is not to withdraw, but just to put your eggs in many different baskets and to be globally diversified.
So what are those fields in which there's still a lot of opening for foreign investment?
I think consumer goods across the board. I think certainly also technology and industrials, right? Governments are going to be more interested in having the benefit of manufacturing jobs on their soil. However, many countries aren't able to bring manufacturing jobs to their economies unless they attract companies. And so I think you're going to see a lot more joint ventures. It could be, for example, a public-private joint venture, so some kind of state company working together with a private foreign investor. But those sorts of deals, I think, are going to become more prevalent. That, I would say, pharmaceuticals, a number of other sectors. I think energy and food are the two commodity sectors that are going to be most subject to potential nationalization, but other ones maybe less so. Yeah.
Wow, very complex, fracturing world, the way it fragments into many different directions.
Yeah.
Very, very fascinating. Thank you, Nick Mulder. I really appreciate getting your insights on this, and thank you for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.
Again, that was Nicholas Mulder, professor of history at Cornell University, speaking with Rhoda Metcalfe. Look for Mulder's article on the new wave of nationalization in the June issue of Finance and Development magazine. Go to imf.org/FND. And look for other IMF podcasts on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen. You can also follow us on X. Our handle is @IMF_podcast. I'm Bruce Edwards.
And I'm Rhoda Metcalfe. Thanks for listening.